This episode discusses crime scenes in detail and also reviews autopsy results. There is brief mention and description of a possible suicide. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you love is struggling, you can get help by calling 1-800-273-8255. We're in the process of creating Spanish language case summaries that can be shared for the unidentified men known as Sebastian Pasqual, Rodolfo or Rodolfo, and Pablo Hernandez Cruz. Once complete, a link to these will be provided on our website. We'll make an announcement on social media when they're complete too. We'll be boosting flyers featuring the victims' information as well. Please share them on social media sites when you see them. In the coming months, we also hope to have a Spanish language audio summary of these cases up on our website. We'll let you know when those are in place for sharing on social media. This is The Fall Line. Over the past 5 years, we've brought you a number of Doe cases, the unsolved murders of victims who remain unidentified and whose cases are doubly unresolved. Even when those victims are presumed American citizens, their identities can be difficult to trace. Before the rise of investigative genetic genealogy, the task was often impossible. But there are unidentified people across the country whose names will be even harder to find because they died as undocumented Americans who had to operate underneath the system, or died while in the process of immigrating or seeking refuge. You may have seen some aspects of this issue covered in the news. For instance, the crisis of bodies, unidentified and identified, found at the U.S.-Mexico border. In the past few years, various humanitarian groups have highlighted many such cases. For medical examiners in border jurisdictions, like in Pima County, Arizona, this plight has been a reality for much longer. According to the Pima County 2019 annual report, the office began counting decedents recovered from border areas in the year 2000. By December 2019, that number was over 3,000. A third of the dead remained unidentified at the time the report was submitted. Pima County puts a heavy emphasis on the identification of decedents recovered at the border. But according to a 2021 Intercept report, nonprofits like Humane Borders have identified other areas of the United States where, quote, counties are overwhelmed, where there have been disturbing discoveries. The Intercept's reporter references a Texas Observer article about Brooks County, Texas. In 2013, a forensic anthropologist from Baylor University who'd been identifying group grave sites uncovered a huge mass grave in Brooks. She revealed the incredibly disturbing disposal of the unidentified remains of hundreds of people, often stacked together in single body bags. They were tossed into single grave plots. This finding, and others like it, partially inspired the recent permanent federal funding for NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. And as The Intercept pointed out, another result of discoveries like this one in Brooks County is spending to support safety measures along the southern border, including 200 rescue beacons and more funding for medical examiners in the region. But that's only a small step in solving an enormous issue, and cases of unidentified, undocumented Americans are not limited to one region of the United States. They might live and die anywhere, and the victims don't originate from a single country or continent or ethnicity or class or background. What they have in common are fewer formal ties, the kind that investigators can follow, to their original identities. In this episode, we're covering victims who are thought to have ties to Mexico, Guatemala, and possibly areas of Central and South America. But know that there are unidentified persons from all corners of the world who need to be reconnected with their identities and with their loved ones. And if a person lived in the United States under an adopted name or a pseudonym, then discovering that information does not create a straight path to solving a case. Not when a family needs notification, not when investigators need a victim's identity, the details of their life, to find their killer. There's a West Virginia case we have attempted to cover for several years. An unidentified decedent whose body was discovered in October of 2009. According to the Associated Press, the presumed Hispanic male was discovered by a local hunter in a field in Morgantown. The medical examiner would later estimate that his post-mortem interval was at least 6 weeks. Per the Gazette Mail, the decedent, quote, appeared to have been hanged with a white t-shirt, fashioned into a noose and strung from an old coal mining truck. However, the Doe Network lists the decedent's remains as having been found beside an overturned dump truck. To our knowledge, investigators have never made a statement as to whether they consider his death to be a possible homicide. There are only a few articles written on the case. Most are no longer available, even through the back doors of Internet archives. But an early local TV report did note that there were no obvious signs of foul play at the scene. The decedent, who was likely in his 30s, was approximately 5'1" and 135 pounds, and wore blue jeans and what are described as, quote, a cloth bracelet and brown chukka boots. Two other identifying features were a healed fracture to his right clavicle and a broken bone in the palm of his right hand. It had healed badly and likely caused a curvature of the palm. He was also carrying what we believe to be a false Georgia identification card. Though the card featured a picture that investigators consider to be a likely match to the decedent, per the Doe Network, they base that on his jawline. The information on the card is presumed to be inaccurate. The Charleston Gazette article doesn't go into detail as to why state troopers believe this, but as Georgia residents ourselves, it's easy to make a guess. Photos of the ID, released on NamUs and on other sites, don't look like any Georgia ID or driver's license issued in the 2000s, not that we've seen in documentation or in our own memories and experience. For example, the address given is an apartment complex, but it doesn't include a unit, something our state requires. And as for the name listed, Pablo Hernandez Cruz, the Associated Press mentions that there was no missing person report filed under that name. It could have been the decedent's real name or an assumed one. There's no way of knowing. Per the AP, his skeletal remains were sent to the Smithsonian for examination, but experts there were unsuccessful in helping to identify him. We've reached out to West Virginia multiple times in hopes of covering this unidentified person's case on the fall line, but we've gotten no reply, other than a denied FOIA request. We hope they're still pursuing his identification. We know that at some point, they visited the apartment complex in Norcross, Georgia, and they spoke to residents there. Reportedly, no one recognized Pablo Hernandez Cruz, or at least no one said they did. Without making contact with authorities, here's the only other information that we can offer you. According to the Doe Network, though he was found with a wallet, quote, containing personal papers, several phone numbers, a framed picture, a Drury Inn hotel key card, and, quote, a keychain with one key, none of the items have helped investigators with a path toward his identity. We keep up with other cases too, like in the Gulf Coast counties of Southwest Florida, like in Collier, home to East Naples. In Immokalee, there are a number of unidentified homicide victims who were presumed to be undocumented immigrants. Some have died under adopted names, or were known only by a nickname or first name to friends and to acquaintances. In these cases, often there isn't enough evidence, whether gleaned from the public or found with the victim, to piece together an identity. You might recall Collier County. We've covered the area on our show before. It's where Salvador Sanchez Azcona, better known as Chava, disappeared in 2016. We brought you his story in late 2020 when his sister, Dolores, and his friend and employer, JP, told his story in a two-part series. He was a resident of the Naples area, and in our coverage of his case, we discussed Immokalee, which is important to this episode, too. We've returned today to tell you about two cases, both from the 1980s. Both feature homicide victims who were presumed Latino males. Both were going by names that may or may not have had any tie to their true identities. Each was murdered while in the Immokalee area, in Collier County. We were able to speak to investigators about one of those cases, an unidentified victim murdered in 1986, who's known as Sebastian Pasqual, late last year. We have the most to share on his case, so he'll be our focus. But first, we want to tell you what we know about an earlier murder. In October of 1980, the news press reported that the body of a man in his 20s was found in Naples, in or around the ground near the Immokalee State Farmers Market, in the early morning. Investigators estimated that the victim, who'd been stabbed multiple times, had been there for several hours. Per the Collier County Sheriff's website, the victim, discovered on the 18th, was a presumed Hispanic male. He was described in police reports as in his 20s and wearing blue jeans and a long-sleeve plaid shirt. He would later be estimated at about 5'6" or 5'7", and between 135 and 154 pounds. He had shoulder-length black hair and was carrying a little over $20 in cash. That fact alone made robbery seem, on the surface, a less likely motive. So, what had happened? He wasn't carrying any form of identification, but, according to NamUs, the victim had scars running along the insides of both forearms and, quote, the entire circumference of the left forearm, some as small as 5 centimeters, and some larger and more visible to a casual observer. That might be an identifying detail to someone who knew him. Now, the way the scarring is described on NamUs does not clarify whether the marks seem to be accidental or intentional. So, we reached out to several of our frequent forensic contributors about these scars, but no one had a definite opinion about their origin based on the description. However, one of our content advisors have friends who run a farm, and as she was reading through this script, thought the description sounded extremely familiar. After speaking with those farming friends, they suggested to us that such specific dual-arm scarring is particularly common in people who fix farming equipment, like balers and mowers, something that usually happens on the farm versus being sent out for repair. Obviously, this is just supposition, but it's a possibility that friends or family of the victim might recognize. Back to the coverage of the discovery of the victim. A later news press article quoted the sheriff as saying that, quote, no type of identification was found, and, quote, no evidence was found to indicate that the offense occurred at this location. It appears the victim was transported to the area and left. He went on to say that his officers had spoken with local farm workers. It seems that some recognized the victim, though they were not able to provide enough detail to identify him past the name that he was using in town, which was Rudolfo or Rodolfo, and to provide some details about his recent life. The Collier County Sheriff's website provides further details, specifically that they interviewed men living in a, quote, labor camp across from the crime scene who recognized the victim. This is when detectives discovered that Rodolfo had been staying in the camp, and that prior to that, he'd allegedly been living with friends in a nearby mobile home park called the Terra Park. Per the investigators, there were approximately 10 men staying in one home who, quote, all stated they knew the victim, though none of them knew his surname. They did have some details on his background. He'd come to the area from Dallas on September 21st and said he had family in Texas, uncles in Dallas and in Houston. Rodolfo's friends couldn't offer further details, except that his remaining family was in Mexico. As to motive, The sheriff's office doesn't offer a theory, but the news press makes mention of something disturbing in one of their 2 reports on the case. In a follow-up article to their initial report on the discovery of his body, the reporter mentioned something that had apparently been a local controversy. Quote, "Recently, farm workers have been complaining that illegal aliens were taking their jobs, and a state labor official warned that it would only be a matter of time before American-born farm workers retaliated." End quote. The sheriff responded that there was no evidence that this kind of attack had occurred, but it seems to say something about the atmosphere and the tension in Collier County. It seems clear that any agricultural worker not born in America, regardless of work visa or citizenship status, might feel unsafe.
You walk in tired and hungry, one bad dinner away from losing it. You don't like to cook. You don't want more takeout. You just want something good. That's why there's Dish by Blue Apron. Pre-made meals with at least 20 grams of protein and no artificial flavors or colors. From fridge to fork in 5 minutes or less. Keep the flavor. Ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.
Just as the young man known as Rodolfo came into Collier County with a group of acquaintances in 1980, another unidentified male, probably a teenager, arrived sometime in May of 1986. According to an acquaintance, someone investigators would later meet, by chance. He was originally from Guatemala, was using the name Sebastian Pasqual. This acquaintance didn't think it was his given name. But on the morning of May 12, 1986, Immokalee authorities were operating without even that information. Police had responded to a wooded area off 2 intersecting streets. And although early reports mentioned callers who'd reported a stabbing, that wasn't something police ever confirmed to the press. In fact, the cause of death has been withheld to this day. That's something we checked with investigators to help preserve chances of identifying this young man's killer. What we do know is this. His remains were discovered along what the Doe Network describes as, quote, the grass of a wooded area, 20 to 30 yards off a foot trail frequented by migrant workers. He hadn't been there long. According to the NCIC report in his police file, no more than a few hours. That same document listed him as somewhere between 5 foot and 5'2", and 120 and 125 pounds. The victim, Sebastian, we'll call him for clarity's sake, was estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 25 years old. That range is important because it falls within the cutoff for inclusion in NCMEC system. That's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which was established in 1984. Sebastian received a NCMEC forensic portrait in 2009, which was a serious upgrade from his case's previous art, which was serviceable but not photorealistic. His NCMEC portrait captures some of the earliest details of the case, as known to investigators. The drawing shows a teenager, who's described in reports as a Hispanic or indigenous male with slick-back, longish black hair. He has a faint mustache, dark brown eyes, and a light to medium brown complexion. He's dressed in the shirt he was discovered in, a pinkish tan Western shirt with a unique floral pattern stitched at the shoulders. What you can't see in the drawing are his blue and white ski vest or his jeans. The police report also describes tan underwear, but others listed as dark blue. He also wore a very specific accessory, a leather belt with a buckle made of silver bullet casings. And there's one more detail. Sebastian wasn't wearing any shoes. His clothes and where his body was found were all investigators would have to go on. Their plan, as in the case of Rodolfo in 1980, was to spread out, talk to locals and seasonal workers to see if anyone knew the young man. Because of his proximity to the trail, which was near a labor camp, they thought it was likely he was staying there or had friends that were. The questions were immediate. Who might recognize him? When was the last time anyone had spoken to him? How long had he been in Immokalee? Did he work? Did he have relatives in the U.S.? Investigators found a few dollars worth of currency in his pockets. His killer or killers hadn't bothered to take his money, so why had they killed him? Nearly 36 years later, the Collier County Sheriff's Office is still working on Sebastian's case. In 1986, officers were able to learn a few more things about him, which their successors will share with you in our interview. In the Collier County Sheriff's Office, some team members are focused on reviewing cold cases. Those who work in the lab keep track of developments in testing, human identification, and forensic techniques that could resolve them. In late 2021, we were able to sit down with 3 representatives from the department. First, there's Detective William Still, who's worked in the sheriff's office since the late 1980s. We were also joined by Holly Chirian, a lab analyst, and Jessica Gerster, a crime scene supervisor, who have all recently reviewed items from the Sebastian Pasqual case. We sat down to speak with them about this case and about other DOE cases, both solved and unsolved, that their department has worked, and how they hope to employ new techniques to resolve their cold cases. We started out by asking Detective Still what difficulties are inherent in approaching cases like Sebastian's, particularly ones from the 1980s and 1990s. What special challenges come when you're working to identify a victim who's traveled to the USA from another country?
Well, obviously, in cases involving these migrant workers and undocumented persons, 9 times out of 10, we don't know who they are. And even in dealing with the ones that we have contact with daily through patrol and through our investigations that are alive, we find that a lot of these people have fictitious identifications. We've worked with witnesses in homicide cases in the past that have actually told us that, listen, when we come across the border and we obtain our identification from whatever resource it may be, we really don't have an opportunity to tell them who we want to be. We just assume the identity of the person's name that's on this identification card. So whether they're getting a unique name and social security number, or whether they're getting one of 100 of the same name and social security number, we don't know. We're at the mercy of either hoping they've got something on them that will be a starting point, or we have nothing at all. We go out here and work in a case, especially something like this with this young man. We're already behind the ball on knowing who this person is, and the chances of finding out legitimately who they are slim to none.
Was this victim carrying any ID that listed his alias?
Well, the name that we were given was provided to us 5 months after his remains were recovered by a person that had traveled, according to this person, into country from Guatemala through Mexico, through Arizona, eventually ending up in Florida. The source of the information, just by haphazardness, saw a photograph of our victim in a detective's office during the conduct of a separate investigation. And this person said, I know that guy. I came into country with him. And so that information, along with the fact that we have a timeline of him only being in country for about a week, suggests that there was really little, if any, time to actually get established with false identification and stuff. The person that gave us the name of Sebastian Pasqual stated he didn't think that was his real name, that that was as far as he could go with any information. And of course, our decedent had nothing on him, no kind of identification at all. But the reporting party had a Polaroid picture of who he knew as Sebastian Pasqual that he provided to our investigators back in 1986. And interestingly enough, the Polaroid photograph depicted Mr. Pasqual wearing the same clothing that he was found in when he was recovered at the scene. That is suggestive of this guy basically living with the clothes he had on his back.
So When the decedent was found, no one else came forward to say that they knew him.
No, and again, this was 5 months after the fact. This guy was the source of information was being interviewed concerning another unrelated matter. Had absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Pasqual's death, and it just so happened that he saw a photograph on the detective's wall, or actually a copy of the composite, and said, "Hey, I know him. Well, why is this picture on the wall?" And it was explained to this guy that the person was unidentified. He'd been found deceased. And ergo, this guy said, "Well, I got a picture of him at my house I took with a Polaroid camera. I can tell you what I know about him," and that's where all that information come from. Unable to be substantiated any other way, because this was the only source of information they had been able to develop as far as who he was.
So, without that chance witness statement, there would have been absolutely no background information at all, and no starting point, other than that the young man known as Sebastian might have come from Guatemala. In our interview with Collier County investigators, we also discussed the crime scene and any possible motive that authorities might have discovered for Sebastian's murder.
We know that it was a homicide, but really, in order to establish a motive, we would have to have a bit more information about who our victim is to get into specific details as to why. The circumstances include the fact that our victim was transient, that he had been drinking heavily at the time the incident occurred, and he was in the area of camp, which is one of many that we have that establish themselves out in Immokalee during seasons when these workers are coming in. He was the victim of trauma, and that was the cause of his death. There is some evidence that he may have been robbed during or shortly after this incident. Not of money, but actually of his footwear. We have his boots and socks that are missing, and his feet were clean, indicative of him being, losing his shoes after the fact. But that's about all we have as far as, suggesting that, it may have been a robbery. But again, with alcohol intoxication and being around other people, it could be a number of things that cause this to happen.
We asked Detective Still how he sought out possible friends, family, or acquaintances of the victim. If Sebastian was a temporary resident and living with other temporary residents, where would the department begin its search? He explained that, in addition to local churches and shelters, the office worked on communicating with community leaders who'd share information about missing and murdered people, and through one-on-one interaction in the community. But as Sebastian had likely come from Guatemala, Collier County would need to reach out much further. We know the sheriff's office has spoken with Guatemalan authorities. What about any other organizations?
Well, it's not just the Guatemalan authorities. We've talked to the Mexican consulate, and back when the case was in its infancy, our detective spoke with a missionary who had been down to Guatemala a couple of times and had contacts down there locally, who had agreed to try to reach out to her contacts in country. And none of this come to fruition. Of course, now the consulates tell us even today that unless we have a town identified where the subject came from and or the city-state, that they cannot help us. The other problem that we've got with this, not as a sidebar, is the fact that back in the 80s, 1986, when this guy was recovered, between like 80, 81, and 91, we had over 1 million undocumented immigrants come in to the United States out of Central America, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Mexico. And with all the civil wars that were going on, you had mass executions of people. A lot of these people were fleeing to get out of the country to save themselves. And so they were leaving with nothing but clothes on their back. There are so many possibilities as to how he got here and from where that it's almost impossible to get a good start on figuring out who he is.
We've previously touched on the complexity that war adds to the cases of the missing and unidentified, not only in each country that experiences conflict, but for the relatives who are separated and the deceased who lose ties to those who could have identified them. There's so much more than we could ever cover in a podcast episode, But we did include some information in our two-part series on the Beaufort County Jane Doe in Season 6. The crux of the matter now is that investigators hit dead ends. And their hope lies where most of us look in 2022, to science. With new case solves reported every week, there's a lot to hope for. Holly Cherian and Jessica Gerster of the Collier County Crime Lab have been using that science to re-examine the case. During our conversation, we spoke with all three representatives about their work and what they hope to accomplish. One thing we discussed was Sebastian's clothing and what investigation in 1986 versus 2021 could tell us about his possible identity. One thing that immediately struck us during our research was that belt buckle made of the bullet casings. Could it be something unique enough that could help identify him?
We have done some research on this, and it's not a quality material type of a belt buckle, and there's no specifics on there to give us a manufacturer or any information about where it originated from. I can tell you that from the clothing and the belt buckle that we recovered from him, that none of these items were really specialty clothing or specialty items. And with regards to the belt buckle itself, you search the internet and put in rifle belt buckles, and next week when you get done going through the first 10% of the responses, then you'll kind of come back and say, I haven't found the belt buckle yet.
This is Jessica. Most of that clothing, if you look at the labels and research it, it just basically takes you back to that age period, which is now considered retro. But there's no specialty stores or an ability to go into that kind of angle with his clothing at that time. And as Detective Still mentioned earlier when we were speaking of, a lot of the clothing that we find with individuals in situations like this that are recent or new to the area, they're getting a lot of their clothing from charities, the Catholic network he was talking about. So it may not even be clothing that they've purchased themselves. It's just what was available to them. But again, our hope is maybe the belt buckle will be a little bit different once we get to that point.
Yeah, the belt buckle is more of a kind of a unique personal piece that he may have picked up somewhere and decided to hold on to. But with regards to the shirt, jeans, we didn't find any property there at the scene where he was recovered from. And ergo, the picture that this guy had provided to the detectives, being probably a week or older, at the time it was taken, it's suggestive that this kid didn't have any kind of clothing with him, wasn't carrying any kind of personal items with him. So chances are he was either living with clothes on his back, or he was picking up stuff along the way from some of these charities and drop box places. Tracking these pants down, Sears tough skins, it's just not going to happen.
We do, in talking of clothing and searching it back to certain lot numbers, we have another cold case where we kind of have that situation that we've pulled the string a lot, where there was a unique tennis shoe that was made at a specific time and sold by a specific store. So when those opportunities are there, we're definitely tugging at the strings, trying to find as much as we can. And we do all of our evidence processing to the extent that we can get as much as we can from it at this moment and possibly in the future. And with that, I'll let Holly kind of explain a little bit more.
So in 2020, I examined all of the victims' clothing, including the ski jacket, the shirt, the pants, the belt buckle. And I was really looking for one, to document the evidence, and that's kind of, as to Detective Still had mentioned, there was no identifying markers on the belt buckle indicating manufacturer or type or where it was made or anything like that. But I also was looking for any biological information or trace information on the evidence. Because the victim was found without shoes, and we wanted to go ahead and conduct a process called M-backing on the clothing. So I performed an M-backing method is pretty much almost working like being able to use a vacuum to obtain any possible skin cells that maybe have left in that area of where it may have an area of the clothing where it may have been touched. So I MVAC'd the bottom ankle areas of his pants in case somebody was trying to remove his shoes or boots, whatever he was wearing, and came in contact with the bottom of his pants. And also on the top of the vest of the ski jacket, in case somebody was maybe possibly standing over him. If there was anything at all that I could possibly obtain from that, I also MVAC the front of his ski jacket. So we will be sending that off to our private lab for analysis. In addition, there were 2 bottles that were recovered from the scene. There was a presumptive blood test that was positive on one of the labels of those bottles, and we have sent that to FDLE, the state crime lab, for analysis as well. So we're hoping that we can get results. Now, there are the challenges of it being a degraded sample, an older sample. So right now we're just crossing our fingers that we're able to obtain the results that, obtain results that are interpretable. So that is kind of where we're at as far as analysis is concerned with this case.
This is Jessica again, and that's just along with us trying to look at the case and not only what can we do at this moment to process it in its entirety, but also to identify him. But once and if he's identified, then we would have any potential evidence that may assist us in figuring out, is there a suspect? So it's just the totality of the entire process from the detective in the very beginning to where we are today.
Listeners will recall that isotopic testing is something that's come up often on our show. There are various ways of conducting it, but when discussing a Doe case, investigators are usually talking about testing hard tissue, like a tooth or a fingernail, to help determine either a possible region of origin or a recent location for a decedent. We asked Tali whether the office had considered that route for Sebastian's case.
We have looked at isotopic testing. We are aware of that as a methodology that is being utilized. However, for genetic genealogy, we'll get more information because the target areas or markers that we're actually looking at will give us not only ancestry or identity or phenotypic markers, but we can also be able to look at particular areas where this person might be from, where in isotopic testing, that is exactly what it's pretty much doing, is only giving us information mainly of where a person is originating from. So us doing this type of genealogy testing gives us a lot more information than just using isotopic testing alone.
In 1986, there were few ways of tracing Sebastian's ancestry. Even now, with investigative genetic genealogy opening the gates to identification, the playing field is not level. Cases in the United States are much more likely to be solved through IgG than in some other nations with less access or less usage, or even popularity of home DNA ancestry tests. And even then, in the US, victims with predominantly European ancestry are much easier to identify. Those populations are comparatively overrepresented in the pools of data, and with more genealogical documentation available. Investigative genetic genealogy has become a hot topic among law enforcement and scientists in nearly every country, but the infrastructure to access, organize, and use the data is far from equal. A number of countries are actively seeking to change that. That's why organizations like GCLAVE, that's Grupo Científico Latinoamericano de Trabajo sobre Identificación Humana, Or, Latin American Scientific Working Group on Human Identification has met for the past decade at the International Symposium on Human Identification Conference. Representatives from a number of countries and regions, like Mexico, Brazil, Guatemala, Chile, the Caribbean, and more, come together to discuss developments in law enforcement, use of DNA techniques, genetic genealogy, and much more. And there are genetic genealogists in the United States who are focusing their attention on building diverse genealogical skills and encouraging larger sample comparison pools. Because, as should be clear, to solve the cases of American victims, we must gather and work with the data that reflects all Americans. Collier County is very interested in the prospect of investigative genetic genealogy and how it may help resolve all of their cold cases. After all, they've already seen success.
We have been able to partner with our local laboratory, DLI, who also partners with a company, Parabon. Parabon, specifically, when they're doing the analysis for the genetic genealogy piece, they have a personally trained genetic genealogist who is specifically trained for the region of Latin America. And she has been able to solve multiple cases with her expertise. And so for this particular case, if we're able to identify the victim, ideally that would be awesome. But if not, she will be able to at least tell us the region that this victim is able to go into. The Collier County Sheriff's Office is also looking at sending myself to a program with the University of New Haven for the genetic genealogy certification. So ideally, in the future, I'll be able to also build out these family trees as well, as I am able to grow in the expertise as well. And we're able to have an in-house representative to actually work diligently and solely on our cases that we have here at Collier County Sheriff's Office.
And I know that if you're able to identify location, that can go really far in terms of actually finding an ID for Sebastian, because then you're able to go to the place ads, speak to locals, etc.
So yes, that is correct. We actually had a case in 2018 with Mostly Harmless. He was a hiker and his remains were found here in Collier County. We attempted our traditional testing methods and had no luck in identifying the victim, and then went through Othram and completed genetic genealogy on this particular victim. They were able to identify the location to the victim being from Louisiana, which gave a huge lead for our investigators. And then we were able to identify the victim within about 2 weeks.
If that, yeah.
So the family was able to have closure. So even getting a location is a huge informative piece for our investigators and our teams here to have better investigative leads to potentially identify a victim.
What do you think will be key in identifying this victim? As experts who have experience working the cases of murdered and identified, are there local, state, or federal changes that you'd like to see to make it easier to solve victims' cases?
This is Jessica. It would be a benefit to have more cooperation between different entities of laboratories as well as law enforcement entities, countries, as we're dealing with in this situation, where there's an ability to share some of the information, whether it be DNA profiles, whether it be fingerprints. We've come across a case of recently where a unidentified has been identified by fingerprints, but wasn't originally identified because the information was going to one source that wasn't having an outreach to other capabilities. And as soon as that changed, you have an ID because they have an opportunity to have access to that other information. And that, I think, tends to be the biggest hurdle from the investigation side to the evidentiary side of it, is trying to not only process things to the best of its ability and investigate it to its best of its ability now and collect what can be, but anticipating what might be coming down the line with technology and what could be changing that, and then figuring out and finding pieces or organizations that are willing to work cohesively together to use that information to this, to get result, which is identifying somebody, just to simply put, their family at ease, or, hopefully solving a homicide. And in my personal experience, that's the biggest hurdle and thing change that I would like to see accomplished.
Well, you have to have perseverance too, because we had one about a month and a half, 2 months ago that was resolved after 40 years, had unidentified remains,
Yep.
had done everything on our side of the house that we could do, had him in the appropriate search engines and places, but the family had never made a report on him, so there was no DNA from that side of the house to compare to CODIS. And after some 39 years, the family finally came in Tennessee, made a report of a missing loved one and provided some buccal swabs. And lo and behold, we get a CODIS hit and identify our unidentified homicide victim from 40 years ago. The one that Jessica's talking about from the last few days, 19 years this guy's been unidentified. And finally, we had a federal resource take a look at some prints that we had and another granted resource, and we got a hit. And so now we know who this person is that did not die under suspicious circumstances, but had been unidentified for 19 years. And, sometimes you just have to have patience and hang in there, and you never know what you're going to get. But certainly we have to treat these cases as though we don't know what we're going to have to work with tomorrow. So we do the best we can to preserve everything, which is a far cry from what it was back in the 80s when we really had no idea what DNA was or how it worked. And we've learned a lot of lessons from that and have carried that forward now into how we treat evidence in these scenes. So, yeah, who knows what we're going to have next week or next year. And if we collect our stuff and preserve it as best we can now, it'll be able to be used under these new types of techniques.
Right. This is Holly. And really from a scientific standpoint, I think successfully being able to resolve a lot of these cases is, as an agency, we are really big about making sure we understand what technologies are available, what technologies are coming up, and how soon can we get our hands on it. And so that's really been a big plus point working for this agency. Collier County is very advanced in how we approach our cases and making sure that we are aware of what scientific things can we do to better solve these cases. And they're really big about educating both the investigators and our lab analysts and our investigators from a crime scene perspective. So that's been really a blessing for us to be able to solve a lot of these cases that we're solving.
This is Jessica again. So on that same mindset, creating what we have created and having that cohesiveness between our homicide detectives, crime scene investigators, and us in lab services, and our medical examiners, our labs, that's the kind of what we've seen accomplished so far is exactly what could just be expanded if it was working on a larger basis outside of just our agency, but between organizations in general. Or, there's a lot of companies that are coming up with new technology, and having that communication and reaching out and saying, oh, what are you doing? How can we use that to this specific case? Or how can we do this here? We're just going to keep, growing and succeeding.
And you got to remember the mindset 40 years ago is a little different than what it is today. Back in 1985, 86, you know what? He's an adult. He can go where he wants to go and come home when he wants to go. So, unless there's some aggravating factor that would suggest something happened to him under suspicious circumstances, people didn't get reports on folks being gone. On kids, yeah. On teenagers, yeah. But on adults, typically that was a no, And there had to be something going on that made this person at risk before people would take reports on them, because, you were invading people's privacy by taking reports on them being gone because they wanted to go. hell, some people don't want to be found. And things have changed now, so we don't mess around with this stuff anymore. If somebody comes in and wants to make a report, we'll take it and let it be what it may be until we can find these people and make sure they're okay.
This is Jessica again, and on that vein of conversation, that's the beauty of genealogy, what we're seeing evolve. And I know that's what Holly and I get excited about when we're working these cases and looking at, is now there doesn't have to be that mentality anymore of, oh, he's grown, he go and come back. Being able to tap into a resource for those individuals who opt in that are just genuinely curious about their history, and now use it on another level to help identify and solve cases. And that is very exciting to be in the presence of at the moment.
There are thousands of unidentified persons in the United States alone, and genetic genealogy is a key step to identifying them, especially with training, development, and resource building that enriches knowledge of diverse skill sets. If you'd like to learn more about the Forensic Genealogical Association, there's a link in our show notes. If you have any information in the case of the 1980 Collier County John Doe, known as Rudolfo or Rodolfo, or the 1986 Collier County John Doe, known as Sebastian Pasqual, please call 239-793-9300. If you have any information regarding the Morgantown County John Doe known as Pablo Hernandez Cruz, please call the West Virginia State Police Morgantown Detachment at 304-285-3200. And keep an eye on our social media. When we have Spanish language summaries of all of these cases ready for sharing, we'll let you know. Thanks to Special Content Advisor Guadalupe Lopez for preparing those. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Before we go, we have a quick announcement. Our release schedule is going to come out in 1, 2, and 3 episode chunks this year. That's based on our research trips. We're traveling to speak with families and experts, and also going to law enforcement departments to help speed up the FOIA process, which has been slowed down so much due to COVID. I'm also in the process of writing a book, so I'm taking advantage of those research trips to gather the Fall Line materials while I'm on the road. As a result, our episode release schedule is a little different in 2022. If you're wondering what's up next, we'll post on Instagram about once a month to keep you updated on what's coming up. We look forward to putting out episodes and getting as many families coverage and as many experts onto the show as we can. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is a fully independent show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us over on Patreon. We're raising Patreon funds to continue to fund the Millbrook Twins billboard and to fund a therapy fund for families who've been on the show. Each and every one of our patrons helps us continue this work, and we're so grateful for your help. On Patreon, you can get early release ad-free versions of our regular episodes, starting at only $5 a month. We've also added blogs and live streams, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research by Brian Waters, Kim Fritz, and Kiana Burgess. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams, Liv Fallon, and Vic Kennedy. As always, our most special thanks to Angie Dodd. Currently, our monthly donation is going to private investigations for the missing. Please join us in supporting this nonprofit. They need funds to help families access the service of PIs.